Yay!
late, which I'll get to in a minute. It is Tuesday, September 8th, 2020, 5:06 p.m. We are 6 minutes late because not one, not two, but all three of the people who were supposed to be on In Lieu of Fun today had tech issues. Jamelle had trouble getting into Crowdcast. Kate had a power outage. And I forgot to turn on my microphone, which created very serious problems because it is impossible to be audible with your microphone off. And no matter how many times I do this, it is still not the first thing I think about when I am inaudible. And Kate says, Ben, I can't hear you. And it's not the first thing Kate thinks about when uh, she says, Ben, I can't hear you. And it's not the first thing when the big blue blogger who I brought in because I was going to test some new tech capability, but Kate didn't show up. So I thought, I don't need Kate. I can test it with the big blue blogger. So I brought him in, but he couldn't hear a word I was saying. And it was not the first thing that anyone was thinking was, did Ben turn on his microphone? We are not allowed to have fun anymore. And we're actually not allowed to have working microphones because we're too dumb to turn them on, or at least I am. But in lieu of fun and in lieu of working microphones on time, 6 minutes late, we do have Jamelle Boie of the New York Times, who it is a pleasure to see again, if only in two dimensions. I'm glad your tech has uh, appropriately repaired itself. Welcome to In Lieu of Fun. Kate, do you want to introduce Jamelle? Kate seems to be frozen.
Yes, she's not there.
Well, I will introduce Jamelle then. Normally, we have a rule where the person who invites the guest introduces the guest, but in this case, Kate is frozen and in a really wry kind of face. Jamelle is a columnist for the New York Times. Uh, Many of us got to know him as one of the most thoughtful Slate writers and as a voice on various Slate podcasts. And he has recently, for the last, what, sort of 2 years, been writing for the New York Times. Is that about right?
I started in 2019, so this would be the my second year. Yeah.
Yeah, so moved over to the New York Times. Kate says her power went out again, so this is not something we can make fun of Kate about. We're just going to wait until eventually she comes back. Her power might come on, it might not. If not, we'll be in lieu of Kate for the hour, as well as in lieu of fun. Jamelle, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I've not done a live show like this before, so it's.
Yes, so they're super fun. They're like podcasts, only the audience gets involved. And we bring in audience members for questions, but not Kate. Anne, can you hear me better this way?
You sound
Um,
great. Yeah, you
okay.
sound terrific.
Some people in the audience were saying they couldn't hear me well, so I'm just going to hold my mic. Figure one person with a power outage is enough. Jamelle, I don't know where Kate meant to start, but since she is gone, I will start where I mean to start. Um, I don't think a year ago any of us expected this election. We all at some level expected this election to be about race in the sense that Trump is pretty openly a racist and gets more open about it all the time. But I don't think a lot of us were expecting the ambient background that we've gotten in the form of the police reform debate, the shootings, the protests, and the COVID response that has been quite as disparate by ethnic background as it has. And so I'm interested for your thoughts. You've written about this in 100 different ways and from 100 different angles, but I'm interested in your high altitude thoughts on race in the campaign.
It's interesting. It's clear that in this big regards, racism, police violence against African Americans, specifically, has become this paramount issue in the election. Not so much in terms of it being a thing that the candidates are necessarily litigating. Like there isn't actually that much argument between the candidates about, you know, the existence of the problem, what to do about the problem, but more as almost a not a almost as a proxy for how voters have come to understand Trump's effect on the entire country, right? Like there's been a bunch of polling the past couple of days, and the most revealing polling to me has been these questions of, do you think President Trump, if elected, will be able to calm the violence in cities? Do you think he'll be able to calm the unrest? Do you think he will be able to handle race relations? And the overwhelming opinion of the majority of Americans, even including a non-trivial portion of voters who are either going to support Trump in the election, said no, he's not capable of handling any of those things. And that, to me, um, suggests that what the protests are doing with the, I hate the term, but the national conversation over race is doing, is putting into really sharp relief those qualities of Trump that people just don't like, and are making them salient for the election. I'm not sure, if not for these protests, that Trump's racism would necessarily be the most salient thing for the election. And there's good evidence that for a good chunk of his voters, including his non-white voters, which he has, and it's a nice chunk of them, it's not really salient for them. But it has become salient for the groups of voters, specifically white college-educated voters, who are the ones who've been moving away from Trump and the Republican Party the past 3 years or so. So that to me, is like, in this weird way, the story of this is not so much about how non-white voters are reacting, but really about how white voters are reacting to Trump, and that to me is very interesting.
And how do you understand that? I mean, I look at the stability of the national polls over the last few, it's really the last few months. They've run from Biden being solidly ahead to Biden being fabulously ahead, from his point of view. But the larger direction of the polls is nil. I mean, they're both of them are, between 5 and 7 points apart in this kind of flat wave, and there's a very similar effect, although with a narrower delta in the battleground states. How do you? I mean, the stability of it, from my point of view, is perplexing because you know it's as though people don't respond to events. But how does the stability of the polls interact with your last point?
That's a good question. I mean, what they've so the stability of the polls is interesting, and I you didn't use the word, but I take it that you find it a little disturbing, and I find it a little disturbing too. How much it's just sort of his, not just his approval, but his favorability. All these things seem to be completely untethered from events. That the fact that he sort of mismanaged what has become the singular crisis of his administration doesn't seem to have had any impact on how voters evaluate him. Um, I think what may have happened, or what may be happening, is that you had, so they haven't gotten as much attention as Obama to Trump voters, but there were Romney to Clinton voters, a good chunk of them, not a ton, but enough to be significant, to be worth measuring and trying to figure out their motivations. And I think what may have happened is that the recent unrest and the president's reaction to it and the pandemic has taken a group of voters who maybe voted for Romney in 2012 rather, who may have always been on the fence about Trump, even if they voted for him in 2016, but have kind of been nudged over into the Democratic column. It's maybe kind of just like giving them the final push. And so one of the interesting things to me is that if you compare the status of the race to Trump's job approval numbers, Biden is basically a point or two, depending, below his Trump's disapproval, and Trump is performing almost exactly at his approval. And so that the extent to which there remains a gap between Biden's performance and Trump's disapproval, I think that's where all the movement's happening. People who disapprove of Trump and are moving into Biden's column, out of Biden's column, maybe into Trump's column, and going back and forth. But it's that like 2 or 3% that is, if you look at even the slight tightening after the conventions, Biden's vote share never really went down very much, maybe by a point.
That's exactly right.
It's some people got off the fence. Trump's vote share went up a couple points, but I really think it's this group of people who do disapprove of the president, but aren't quite ready to pull the trigger on a Democrat for whatever reason.
You and I have a number of things, background things in common, but one of them is having spent time in conservative areas of Virginia. You grew up I think in the Hampton Roads area. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
And you live in Charlottesville, which is not itself a conservative area of Virginia, but is surrounded by conservative areas of Virginia. I have a cabin out in the Shenandoah Valley, which I am just amazed when I drive around that area, the ratio of Trump signs to Biden signs. It's 10, 15, 20 to 1. And I am curious how you understand. I assume that is replicated all across rural America. If you look at the map, wherever the white population exceeds a certain, I don't know whether it's 80 or 90%, whatever the number is, and the sort of, and the, and the population density thins out to a certain minimal, you get these incredibly intense Trump areas that is different, qualitatively different from prior Republican candidates. And my question is that fundamentally about race, or is it fundamentally about something else?
I don't think it's fundamentally about race, although race is a part of it. I mean, all these things are tangled together. You can't really, take them apart so simply. So, the urban rural polarization, which is basically the phenomena that's happening. It's my understanding of it is cultural along many different areas, right? So it reflects sort of the growing influence of political, conservative evangelicalism. It reflects a sense that cities, kind of irrespective of race, are, contain people who are viewed as like not productive, as illegitimate, like unauthorized immigrants. It reflects a media environment, right? Sort of like I don't think you can take out of this story the influence of conservative talk radio and Fox News and all these outlets that kind of explicitly push an us versus them narrative. It reflects, and this is not cultural, it's material, but it reflects the extent to which rural areas have been stagnating, have seen sort of the loss of population, of opportunities, and this isn't. I mean, the key thing to remember in all of this is that the voters who are becoming ever more reactionary, not even really conservative, but ever more reactionary, aren't necessarily the voters who are being directly affected by changing material circumstances. They're often the people who are actually a little secure or even relatively secure, but see the change, but feel intense anxiety about the change, right? So it's the contractor who is doing quite well for himself, but whose brother might, you know, might be unemployed and on disability. It's that kind of thing. Um, and so
What
it's sort of,
what do you want to what do you call that's such a great point though. And like that is literally my family. Like that is very much like my mom's family. Like they're just like a huge diaspora like they're not diaspora. There's a huge differential between like her various siblings. And like how they vote and like how they kind of think of themselves. Um and I completely agree with that, but like what would you call that? Like class doesn't, like people in the chat are saying class, but I don't know if it's class. Like it doesn't seem like they're these micro classes almost or something. I don't know like how to break it out. Like it's yeah.
well, I mean, I think the language of class is useful here, but just not the language of class. Like Americans tend to use the language of class as a proxy for education, as a proxy for the type of work, right? Sort of, if you are our
For
hypothetical,
professionalism.
right, our hypothetical contractor would be understood as a working class, even though they own a business, maybe make six figures, they own property, right? This is, if you're using sort of like, the terminology of class comes out of left wing politics. If you're using kind of a Marxist take on this, that's not a working class person. But it's not like an owner of capital either. It's sort of this in between class.
It's a different sense of the word class, right? In the Marxist sense, the term class refers to what you do for a living.
Because it's based on more of like almost a caste system.
Well, it's how it relates. It's how it relates. It's in the Marxist sense. It's how you relate to production, not necessarily
Right.
what you do for a
Yes.
living, right? And so,
In this sense, it's how your grandparents related to production, or how your parents related to the production.
That's truly American, by the way. Like I think that's like the difference between like what your grandparents did and how you related to production. Now, hi, Mike Godwin. You would have loved Cynthia Estlin yesterday, Jamelle. She was great. She was like, we were talking a lot about this, about labor and professionalism and how it kind of like, and how it changed the stuff. But anyways, I cut you off, but I wanted to just say that like, I'm very curious about this. So keep going.
yeah, no, I mean, this is a, so the way my take on this kind of like class of people, which I think should be considered the Trump base. Like the marginal Trump voter might actually be, a former factory worker or a working person who is, from a stagnant place or whatever. Like that voter who made the difference in key states in 2016 does exist. But the typical Trump voter, it's much more like the voters who have been, in the news a bunch. People who own property, who own businesses, they own car dealerships and fast food franchises, and they're contractors, family-owned businesses, but they perceive themselves as being under siege from below, from immigrants, from the poor, from racial others, and they perceive themselves being under siege from above, from liberal elites who want to take their tax dollars and give them to people who give them to that bottom, a government that seems to defer to everyone else but them. And I think that the way to understand this group is that two things are, well, their status in society is eroding, not in terms of like their actual security, material security, but just in terms of the amount of political and cultural deference they receive, which kind of makes Trump a perfect avatar for them, because Trump himself, like his entire career, is defined by this anger at the lack of deference he receives from the top of society, whether that's sort of Manhattan real estate moguls, whether that's the former president of the United States, all Trump wants is the kind of deference and respect that comes with with
With
ownership,
old
with
money.
power, right?
Is it an old money, new money thing, do you think, to a certain extent?
No, I don't think it is, because I think it's yeah, I don't think it's that. I think it
I
has
I
more,
think I think it's weirdly the opposite.
right.
Yeah.
He wants the respect of a self-made man, having in fact inherited everything, and
Yeah.
it's not new money. He's not old money. Um, he's medium-term money who resents not being self-made and not like he wants to be Mike Bloomberg, right? The guy who was basically, he wasn't poor, but he wasn't, and he created a business that actually uh, uh, does something. And I don't mean to praise Mike Bloomberg, but I think when Trump looks at himself in the mirror, he sees somebody who created all this wealth, and he deeply resents not being engaged with on that basis.
One point I want to make is that this stratum of voters is not like a new thing. It's not like a new phenomenon. And if you look at kind of the history of American reactionary movements, this is basically the historical and traditional popular base for these sort of things. So this, not to sound too inflammatory, but the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s is less of a, there is vigilantism and terrorism, but the mass movement is less of an 1870s style of vigilante movement and much more akin to kind of like a very, very racist and nativist Elks Lodge. Claimed.
Sorry, I just like hadn't heard someone talk about the Elks Lodge in a
No,
long time.
it's so true. And
It's so
if you
accurate.
look
Yeah,
at
like,
if you look at when Hugo Black was accused correctly of having been briefly a member of the Ku Klux Klan, he talked about it in exactly that
Yeah.
way. It was like, well, I was a rising Alabama politician, and there was this fraternal organization that you kind of had to be a member of. And the amazing thing about that explanation is that it was accepted because it was, in fact, more or less true for exactly the reason that Jamelle is describing.
Right. And that was the mass base of that clan was not actually the poor whites or the quote unquote rednecks or any of those people. It was the middle. It was the small shop owners. It was the prosperous farmers. It was these people or who could claim a level of ownership and material security, but were not the owners of capital writ large. But were certainly not, the working class or the proletarian class. They were sandwiched in between, and that just creates. I mean, I'm using Marx's terms, and Marx has a term for this. In the 18th premiere of Louis Napoleon, he calls them the petit bourgeois, sort of a group that feels this intense status anxiety relative to other classes in society, and it makes them the most reactionary class in society, somewhat counterintuitively.
Mike Godwin, the floor is yours.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
yep.
We can.
So good. So Jamelle, a longtime reader, first time caller.
Hello.
Say, hi. So I wanted to ask in response. I thought a lot about your column earlier in the year about how it doesn't matter if Trump doesn't want to leave the White House if he loses. And I hate to say this because I like your writing so much, but I found it wholly uncomforting. I mean, it's not that you weren't formally correct, but it seems to me that a lot of the things that we assume about the transition of power when elections, at least theoretically, turn someone out, is adherence to norms. And here we have a figure who obeys no norms. And so I think the sort of deep question is how much can this norm violating or norm corroding president be expected to not, be expected to do anything other than pull out all the stops to thwart a transition of power if he loses in November? That's a version of my question.
Yeah, I mean, my take on this has always been that the real uh, threat danger has never been the point of never been the final point of transition, right? Like if Trump loses in November and it's clear and unambiguous, and we get to January, I think he's leaving office. I don't think there's in order for him to not do that, there has to be actually some level of not even popular support, but support within the bureaucracy or support within the military. And if we get that far, I just don't see it happening. But what I do see happening, and have always seen happening, is basically an attempt to do everything he can, short of explicitly torching ballots, to reduce the popular say on the election. And then if he ends up losing unambiguously, and that's kind of that word's bearing a lot of weight here, because I do think that if the outcome is at all ambiguous on November 3rd and afterwards, then it's sort of all bets are off, and we're kind of really in for the fight for our lives. But that transition period, I think, is going to be a period where, if nothing else, the administration just makes a lot of mess. From attempting to destroy evidence of its behavior in office to setting up crises. I mean, yeah, all of that. The other thing, I don't think I've ever written a column on this, but I have written about it on Twitter and in my newsletter. But one thing, I have been thinking about as well is, to what extent, like, how do other Republicans behave, in this world? Let's say Biden wins. The result is exactly in line with the polls. So it's like he wins by 7.5, points, 300 electoral votes. I mean, what do you expect? And it's relatively unambiguous. But let's say Trump demands, right? Let's say there's rumors of voting irregularities in Wisconsin, and Trump is tweeting furiously about it. Does the Wisconsin state legislature attempt to send a rival slate of electors instead of the ones for Biden, right? Like, if you start to think about what the possible actions of allied lawmakers in the states, that's also when things get a little dicey and it's hard to predict. I mean, I think one of the things to think about in all of this is that there are many, many actors who will be involved in the election and the aftermath, and not all of them, they may be Republicans and may be Democrats, but they don't necessarily all have the same incentives. They don't necessarily see themselves as beholden to, if you're a Republican in the Trump administration, you don't necessarily see yourself as your future is dependent on Trump winning, right? And so it's all these people whose names we don't know, who are at these hinge points, and it's sort of like, what do they do when moments of pressure come up, if they come up? And that's a question I can't really answer, but it's something I think about a lot.
Yeah, just to foot stomp Jamelle's point here, I think there is a little bit more automaticity in the process than people understand. So a few key points that are just basic points of law that I think are comforting here. One is that all of the relevant statutes for purposes of the assigning of electoral votes here are state law matters, not federal law matters. And that means that the president's ability to resist them is very, very limited. if the Secretary of State of the relevant state certifies the majority vote for Joe Biden, the president has no influence over that. Secondly, and this is actually, it's not fashionable to be excited about the original design of the Constitution, but this is actually part of the original design of the Constitution for exactly this reason. The Electoral College does not kind of convene in a body like Congress. It it is dispersed and it reports. And again, all of that is a function of state processes, not federal processes. And so you can, there are ways, particularly in states with state legislatures, that could theoretically appoint a set of electors for the president, even though he lost. That is a theoretical possibility. But remember, that only matters if that's the only state, if that's the decisive state. Beyond that, you have a real collective action problem if one state defects and doesn't behave that way, or if a governor vetoes the state's action. You end up with the default options being very pro-fairness. And so I think people are somewhat overstating the possibility of the president simply refusing to comply with being defeated, which is not to say it's impossible. It's just to say that the stars would have to align in the perfectly awful way in order for it to happen.
Yeah, one thing I earlier this year, I think maybe February, January, I don't know, I wrote a column about sort of riffing off of a book called Paths Out of Dixie, which is about the Jim Crow South. And the argument it makes about the Jim Crow South, that we should understand the Jim Crow South properly as an authoritarian regime, and that the collapse of Jim Crow is being akin to post-authoritarian democratization we'd see in other parts of the world. And one of the points the author makes, whose name I cannot recall at the moment.
Hold on, I'll look it up.
Thank you. One of the points the author makes, and more this is a point by way of description, is that the collapse of the Reconstruction government in the South into Jim Crow authoritarianism wasn't like a coup, right? It took place through legal mechanisms and through legal pathways. It relied on turning a blind eye to violence, turning a blind eye to fraud, or actively facilitating it, but it still had the veneer of legality. And I think that's actually, when thinking about democratic deterioration in the United States, that's a really important point, that these things don't happen like movies, and the veneer of legality is actually really important. Would-be authoritarians like what they're doing to appear to be legitimate in some way, and so the extent to which, if Trump, is trying to stay in office after losing, the extent to which they would have to basically either break the law or bend the law in such a way that it is effectively being broken is a disadvantage for them, because you lose the veneer of legality, which is actually very important.
Veneer of legality is this term that did you coin that in that article? Because you should coin that term and hold on to it tightly.
Okay.
but I feel like it's a nice way of actually putting, to a certain extent, Jack Goldsmith's one of my favorite articles one of the only articles I read after 2016, 2017 about the president, because I was too depressed to read most of them, but was in the Atlantic, I think, which is about the norms of breaking the presidency. And his was much more about how the norms of how there are so many things that are unstated in the legal structure and the constitutional structure around the executive branch that are really norm-based and not based in law at all. But I think that's I think that they're two sides of the same coin. It's what you guys are talking about, frankly. I think that there is the one hand in which there's a bunch of stuff that is just simply not done and has nothing to do with law. And then there's a whole lot of other stuff in which just the appearance of exercising and acting under the shield of law is the appearance itself is enough to almost to be law. or to act in the same way. And so I don't know if that's making any sense, but I just think that that's like a really great way of putting it. Alina.
Hey.
Hello. You have a
Hi.
question.
Yeah. One of the comments that when people talk about you, they always say Jamelle knows his history. And it made me think, wait, do the other columnists or journalists not know their history? So, and is it something that you've always been good at? I mean, I would think that it's a prerequisite of sort of being a public columnist, but maybe I was wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to comment about my colleagues. Which sound, but I really mean that. I'm not gonna. My colleagues are great, and I respect them a lot, and I mean that sincerely. For my part, I just over the years, I guess I started my first job in journalism was about 10 years ago, and sort of since then, I have found myself both in regular conversation and dialogue with actual academic historians, both for work and just as part of my social life. Just so happened that as my social circle involves a large number of actual historians, and my interests have been as such that I read a lot of academic history. That's sort of I spend a lot of time, if I'm interested in a subject, I spend a lot of time kind of diving into what the historiography looks like. What are the important books? What are the books for which there are lots of debate? Whenever I read something, I always try to, read the book, read reviews in journals, read critiques, kind of figure out how the historical community feels about the work and how they
better
understand
than me.
it.
I usually just start with reading the reviews. I'm like, this seems right. Sorry.
So I don't know. I mean, I have my personal interest, and those drive a lot of it. And I read quite a bit, and I've over the years figured out how to incorporate that into both the making of arguments and just the sharing information. I mean, I find this stuff really interesting, and I think other people would also find it interesting. So I try to make an effort to share, to act as a conduit for real historians by taking in their work and kind of putting it forward for broader public consumption and encouraging people to actually read their work. That's kind of the big thing. I consider myself heavily indebted to real academics, so I think always think people should actually read their work, not my attempts at summarizing or utilizing it.
Yeah.
All right, so I have tried repeatedly to bring in Don Rollins to ask this question, but I have failed as part of our ongoing series of tech failures on In Lieu of Fun. So I'm just going to read his question. He says, Mr. Boie, the New York Times gig is fine, but how did you get to be America's premier critic of breakfast cereals?
Well, the short story is that I was at the grocery store. This was last year at some point, and I saw a box of cinnamon toast churros or whatever, and so I bought them out of curiosity, and then decided it would be funny as a bit to just eat them and review them on camera. And I put a couple of these on Twitter for various cereals, and Serious Eats decided it would also be funny if they just ran my bit as a real feature. So that's kind of it. I like breakfast cereal. I actually don't really eat it that often, and it's a fun change of pace, respite from real stuff to kind of scour grocery aisles in Charlottesville for the strangest and most unappealing sugary cereals I can find and try them for people.
Have you ever
chocolate frosted sugar bombs?
Chocolate frosted sugar bombs, which when that comic was written, when that strip was written, that
Right?
sounded insane. But now
It's not.
it's only chocolate frosted sugar bombs. That's
That's
all that exists.
wow, you sound like such a dad right now. You're like, oh, I can't find healthy cereal anywhere for my child.
So my friend Joe and I used to have this game of making up fake breakfast cereals. And the idea was to make them breakfast cereals that were completely obviously wrong and yet seemed like the kind of thing you could market. Um, for example, we thought one of the great unmarketed breakfast cereals was just called hominids, which were a combination of sort of frosted fossils of prior Australopithecines and I don't know, Homo erectus, combined with corn frosted. So you would eat like bones of hominids in corn pops, but then occasionally bite on one that was real. Um,
And
and
this
we
is
had a
not funny. This is terrifying. This is
so
like a
sorry.
horror
I mean,
show.
well, they weren't really designed to be funny. They were designed to be the kind of like real breakfast cereals, only not. And things that were just just plausible, but they had to be 100% wrong, but also a little bit right. And so there was we came up with a whole bunch of them, and we have not yet marketed any of them.
No kidding.
Catherine Maddox, back on planet Earth, the floor is yours.
Hello. Hi. I'm a huge fan of yours. Love your work.
Thank you.
So, and you're also very humble, which is always nice in this sort of media landscape of a lot of stars. So, my quick question to you is, and this comes from a pretty pessimistic place. Do you think that the Democratic ticket is strong enough to defeat Trump? And do you notice that they are not articulating any sort of grand, concrete plans to begin cleaning up all the mess? And do you think that's a problem? Thanks.
Do I think it's strong enough to beat Trump? Probably. I have a hard time when you look at how stable the polls are. When you look at how how much our politics are shaped by this basically structural polarization, by extreme partisanship. When you look at how much things seem to be literally plug and play in terms of it doesn't quite matter who the particular individuals are. You still get these like broad dynamics. It's it's possible that a different Democratic ticket would be doing better. I think it might be true, or it might be doing worse. I think there are ways in the margins you can imagine that's true in either direction. But I'm sort of not sure how much we can attribute the current status quo of the election to, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris specifically versus them being Democrats in most of the country not liking Donald Trump, and the Democrats being the only viable option to not have President Trump. Having said that, I personally am disappointed that the ticket has not spent very much time articulating a sort of de-Trumpification message. I think that if setting aside my particular kind of like ideological views and hobby horses, if Joe Biden, who has wanted to be president his entire life, wants to have any hope of having a successful presidency, it is going to rely on kind of focused de-Trumpification of the administration. It's going to require him, or of the federal government. It's going to require an effort to, bring in as a large new cohort of qualified civil servants. It's going to require an attempt to do something about the fact that the federal judiciary has been stacked with a whole lot of Trump cronies. it's going to require congressional Democrats, especially if the Democratic Party wins the Senate, to really not show any hesitation about passing the kinds of big legislation needed to begin to reverse or claw back at what's happened over the past 4 years. It's really going to require a bunch of people to operate in a mode that they've never really operated in before.
And whoa, let me pause you right there, because I think it's a fascinating, challenging point. What is a program? I mean, if we took this as a, like, if we accept that this was a non-democratic movement, democratically elected or quasi-democratically elected, given the rules of our system, that did a heck of a lot of work over the last 4 years, and you come in and you simultaneously want to reestablish a whole lot of norms that Trump trampled on, and you want to de-Trumpify. And whether you want to call that a lustration project or but you want to undo some of it. But you also don't want to contribute to the violation of norms that you have sought out as Joe Biden to defend. What does a program like that look like?
That's a really good question. And I think, the parts I feel qualified to opine about they involve strengthening those places where it's clear that our kind of democratic processes could be stronger and have been stronger in the past, right? So lots of people have spoken about passing a new Voting Rights Act, but like really think seriously about what I think is required. Looking over the entire country, it's it's clear that there are states like Wisconsin, states like North Carolina, where there are sort of active efforts to keep the public from actually shaping shaping the direction of public policy, shaping the direction of government by extreme gerrymandering, by utilizing courts to the state court system to shut down efforts to expand voting and whatnot. So something like a revitalized Voting Rights Act might actually look like, right, sort of nationwide pre-clearance instead of just the South. So is that a norm violation?
I don't think nationwide pre-clearance is a norm violation.
No,
but
let me give you an example.
Not. I mean, nationwide pre-clearance is a radical, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it in the sense of dramatic. It's a dramatic policy proposal, but it's something that there may be a lot to say for. But let me propose two things to you that I think Joe Biden has to be thinking about right now. One, Chris Wray, the FBI director, decent guy, hasn't. If you replace him, you are violating and probably killing forever the norm of the 10-year FBI director. If you don't replace him, you are allowing Donald Trump to have gotten away with the quite radical norm violation of removing the FBI director and replacing him with your own. That's example number one. I don't know what the right answer to that problem is. There's a heck of an argument, in my view, for the idea that Trump shouldn't get the benefit of installing his guy at the FBI. Now, that said, Chris Wray is a decent man who has not done he's not done a horrible job, although he's not done a wonderful job, in my view. If he had done a wonderful job, he would have been fired. There's a pretty good, I think I can make a pretty good argument on either side of that. Example number two, DC and Puerto Rico statehood. It's the right thing to do in the case of DC. It's the right thing to do in the case of Puerto Rico, in my view, if and only if the people of Puerto Rico want it, which is a complicated little question. But let's take DC. The benefit of it is that it's the right thing to do. You may or may not have the votes to do it as Joe Biden. It will come across as a partisan exercise that's designed to get 2 new Democratic senators. As a DC resident, I don't really mind that it would take a brute force act to get it done. On the other hand, it would presumably encourage future Republican administration to divide Wyoming in half and create North Wyoming and South Wyoming, right? For exactly the same reasons. And so my question is, how aggressive should you be?
That is, I think that is the big question. Assuming that there's any kind of will to go in this direction, I am of two minds here. The first is tit for tat is just going to further deteriorate kind of the bonds that hold American democracy together to the extent that they even still exist. And it would only pave the way, as you suggested, for an attempt to go even further. That's where I am sometimes. Where I am other times is that maybe the way to establish new norms is just to demolish the old ones completely, right? To not completely adhere to them, to play constitutional hardball,
I don't think it's about the if you're going to demolish new norms, I don't think it's about the Constitution. To be fair.
Well, I mean, I think it because, like, creating a new state is perfectly constitutional. Like, there's
yes, okay,
right.
Yes,
but
yes.
it's not. It would be a violation of norms in some sense to create a state, or at least modern American political norms to create a state on such like a nakedly partisan basis. In terms of 19th century political norms, that was pretty much the norm.
Pretty normal.
Yeah, that's why you created a state in the first place.
But I mean, there's a lot. But look, if you want to make states on the basis of partisan advantage, there's a lot of options. You got Guam, you got Saipan and the Northern Mariana Islands. There's American Samoa. And these are tiny little entities, but you could do it. And yet I think you at some point would say, and I would certainly say, ooh, that makes me, ditto court packing, right? I adore Merrick Garland. I'm offended by what happened to him. And it's wrong. And I don't believe in court packing. And yet, could I tell honestly, Majority Leader Schumer, that's an indefensible thing to do because there are these norms that we all observe? No, I couldn't say that for a minute.
Right. I think maybe the thing to do is there are areas. So DC statehood is actually a good example of this, right? It's an area where it is partisan, yes. It is in some sense a violation of norms, yes. But as you said, it is the right thing to do. It reflects sort of the fulfillment of actual longstanding commitments the country says it has. It would solve a couple actual concrete problems for the residents of DC. And so you do it knowing that it's going to be controversial, but also knowing that there is a case for it outside of just kind of naked partisan gain. With the courts, right? If maybe not the Supreme Court, but the federal judiciary is probably smaller than it should be. The last time it was really expanded was in the 80s. So we actually do need more judges. We need more people on the bench. And so there's your rationale. Yes, the obvious motive is to sort of dilute Trump's impact on the judiciary, but you are also solving a problem. And I think looking for those areas where part of what Trump and his allies have been able to do is take advantage of stasis in the system and the presumption that it will always be static as a way to make a move, right? So all the Supreme Court and court gamesmanship depends on this idea that the court is of a static size and the judiciary is of a static size. Attempts to
But doesn't that, sorry, but like that is exactly like the fact that you learn when you're in like grade school and you're learning civics that it's like 9 Supreme Court justices and 50 states. Don't you ever, like, I know that there's tons and tons of politics around PR and DC becoming states, but does it ever occur to you that there is just like kind of there's this level of stasis that we're a nice round number? And I'm really like, I'm not joking. Like, I really think that like Americans identify with 50 states and like that is just like who they are to a certain extent.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think so. The United States hasn't had a new state since the 60s, hasn't had a new constitutional amendment since the 70s. You know, there's a sense, I think, in the country that our constitutional development is over. That the kind of the boundaries of the U.S. have been reached, and it's all just sort of management. And I think that I've not written this out, so I apologize if it sounds a little incoherent. But I think that a real problem facing American politics right now is exactly a lack of kind of constitutional change, you know, geographical change. In the 19th century, especially after the Civil War, political problems were just solved by creating new states, right? Like you could just change the map and that would help solve it. That would help release some of the tension and pressure that built up in the political system. And we have not been able to kind of do anything to release the pressure and tension. And I sort of think that a case for, you know, DC statehood, a case for, you know, I think Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and another representative introduced a bill to kind of give Puerto Rico a referendum that they would construct on their own, but it would be binding on the United States, so they could decide, you know, whether they want statehood or not, or whether they want independence. You know, passing something like that, there are proposals to take the U.S. territories and basically either offer them independence or offer them kind of like a federate, you know, making them all vote, not necessarily states, but still voting members of Congress, to kind of expand the federal nature of the United States. You know, those are things that would be controversial and partisan, but they would also serve to just disturb the equilibrium of American politics and force things to go in one direction or the other. And you can kind of understand, if you wanted to, you could understand the Trump administration is basically trying to do that from the perspective of, like, you know, white nationalists, kind of nudging the structure in the United, like trying to push the United States in one direction on one path to disturb the equilibrium, and to produce some kind of forward movement. And I think, you know, not necessarily on the left, but just kind of people who are not on board with that project need to be thinking about ways in which we can disturb the political equilibrium. The political scientist Lee Drutman has a great book called Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, about kind of multi-party democracy in the United States. And thinking seriously about what it would mean to bring multi-party democracy in the United States is another one of the things. It's sort of sub-constitutional. It doesn't really require any major changes to the Constitution. It's all federal and state law. Yeah. But it's the kind of thing that, you know, wouldn't solve every problem, but would create a new set of incentives. And I kind of think that's what's missing in American politics right now, a new set of incentives.
Yeah.
All right. So we had a conversation the other day, and it would be wrong to let you go without giving you a chance to address it, in which we were talking about Andrew Sullivan and Ben Smith's critique of him, in which he quoted you saying
he
something.
didn't actually. I just looked it up, by the way. I also remember him quoting him, but he didn't.
Paraphrased then. Giving a really complicated assessment of Andrew Sullivan. And so I was just, it was one line, and I was interested in your sense of both Ben Smith's critique of Andrew Sullivan and also, in your own words, how do you assess Andrew Sullivan these days?
Yeah. Uh, well, I thought Ben's column profile of Sullivan was really interesting. I think I think he was maybe a little too generous to Sullivan's description of himself when it comes to questions of race and IQ and all of that, which I think gets to my take on him. So the thing I wrote was a couple years ago, and it was basically
Wasn't it when you were at Slate?
it's when I was at Slate, and it was responding to a question Sullivan asked in a column asking that if disadvantage is the product, if sort of Black disadvantage has more to do with racism than culture or personal behavior, and how is it that Asian Americans do so well? And the response I made was that you have to kind of disaggregate Asian Americans, and many Asian Americans, depending on their subgroup, are not actually doing all that well relative to the white population. But B, there's like a whole history and a lot of work and research done on this notion of this idea of the model minority, of the ways in which Cold War tensions and the history of Chinese and Japanese Americans within the United States, the civil rights movement, all of these things, major changes in immigration law created both this ideal of Asian Americans as more successful and also created the conditions for some Asian Americans to be quite successful. And so
there's also, not to interrupt, but there's like in American culture and American cultural history, like the two minorities the minority are Black people and then white people. And that is it's not until much later that that Asian minorities even enter the sphere of like cultural understanding.
Right. So my argument in my column for Slate was essentially that that question that Sullivan asks, I think, reflects a basic incuriosity that is just like a fatal flaw of his writing these days. That's a question with an answer. It may not be an answer that he likes, right? It may not be an answer that fits with his priors about culture and ability and IQ, but there's an answer that exists, found, by people who've done serious work for a lifetime. And that is where I think I land on Sullivan these days. That I had a column this summer on the occasion of Juneteenth, kind of summarizing a bunch of research on the abolition of slavery. And the point I made at the very top was that the way to understand the abolition of slavery is that the enslaved were the prime movers in every action that led to its abolition. So, for example, Massachusetts abolished slavery in, I think, 1783. And it's directly because enslaved people petitioned the courts using the Revolution and the Declaration as a basis for their claim to argue that, listen, if you are now this republic that believes in universal rights of man, this is not compatible with slavery. We deserve to be free. And courts in Massachusetts agreed. And that led to the gradual, the abolition and emancipation of slaves in Massachusetts. And if you look at the history of slavery in this country, what you see is time and time again, the people who are either driving the action or the people who are immensely influential on white Americans who would go on to be very important. So, say William Garrison, for example, they're African Americans. They're the enslaved. They're the formerly enslaved. The fact that slavery is such a contentious political issue in the 1830s and 40s is in part because roughly 2,000 to 5,000 enslaved people were escaping north from the South every year, yes. Which was creating a huge amount of political pressure, both for yes. Southerners who are like, we're losing a lot of money and this is undermining the institution, and for Northerners who are like, oh, hey, look,
harboring them.
Right, harboring them. I just met this person. They're telling me horrible things. What are we going to do about it? And so just on that scale, you have the actions of the enslaved kind of driving American politics. So I summed all of this up in my column by saying the slaves freed the slaves. Pithy way of summing this up. And Sullivan got very mad about this. Thought this was an attempt to erase the history of white abolitionists, erase the history of Lincoln and the Union Army. And to me, that reaction, which is sort of hyperbolic and incurious and offended, just sums up where he is these days. Like, not someone who's actually interested in trying to learn more about the world, someone who is trying to enforce a version of orthodoxy on the world.
Jamelle Boie, you're a great American, an incredibly diverse
Holy
mind,
cow.
and
Yeah.
it is a total pleasure to hang out with you. Come back and join us anytime.
We didn't get to do your photos, but can we? Okay, we're going to do it again sometime.
Yeah, no, I will definitely show up again. This was a lot of fun.
Come back and we'll do the photos first that time, so we don't run out of time. Kate, who do we have tomorrow?
Oh, damn. Who do we
Carl
have tomorrow?
Bergstrom and
Carl Bergstrom.
Ravens.
Carl Bergstrom with his Ravens, and then Emily Bazelon, and then Ben Smith.
And until then,
yep.
What do we say?
We don't have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, we have massive tech problems, but incredibly diverse minds.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Jamelle. It was so nice to see you.
Likewise. Thank you.